Good morning, I'm Ron Spate, the Premium Protein Specialist for Cisco, Arizona. Today we're going to talk about the basics on New York strips and the steaks that come out of it. So as you can see right here, I have a whole New York strip. Lean on one side, fat on the other. And there's actually two known ends to the New York. The first one, this is what I call the rib end. Some people will call this the anterior end. This is the part that connects to the ribeye. So you can see this looks exactly like a ribeye steak. And then this right here is what you would call the sirloin end or the vein end. So this muscle right here is actually the beginning of the top sirloin steak. So there's a little bit of trimming on here that we need to do, but let's first of all talk about tail length. Okay, so the tail is this section of fat that comes off of the strip right here. And there's a couple different ways you can buy this piece of meat. The old school way was what you call a 2x3, then it became a 1x1, and then it became a 0x1. So what that means is the 2x3, they used to measure off of the eye right here 2 inches, and then off of this side they would measure 3 inches, and then they would cut off, and you would be getting all this extra fat in here, which really is useless for the operator. That became known, and so they began to do some value-added product to it, which is they would measure 1 inch off of here and 1 inch off of here, and then they would cut it, and that was what was known as a 1x1. So value-added progressed even further to what is now known as a 0x1. So 0 inches off the eye here, 1 inch off the eye on the rib end. And what that's done is when you cut that across, it eliminates a lot of product that the end users have no use for. So the other thing that 0x1's evolved into is that a 1x1 or a 2x3 had no trimming done on the back side. With the 0x1, part of the value-added process that you're buying is that has a guarantee of a 1/4 inch average fat over the back side. So, you know, with the 1x1 or a 2x3, sometimes you can get that much fat on the back side, particularly in this part right here, which is known as the saddle. So if you start running into exorbitant amounts of fat when you purchase a 0x1, we have recourse of action to go back to the supplier and get some credit and get the specification corrected. So now that we're in the 0x1 form, now there's still some trimming we need to do to make this properly eating New York strip steak. So the first place we're going to start is on the underside belly right here, which is where the bones from the short loin lie. So if you think about a T-bone steak, right, here's the T-bone. This would be the big side, the New York side, and the little round side would be the fillet. So that little bone in between the two is removed from right here. And these guys' knives are very sharp, and you got to watch for actually surface of the bone, which is left in here, for when these guys scoop that product out with their knife, it actually removes part of that. So you always want to feel in here for little cartilage pieces and remove any of the stuff that would be an unpleasant eating experience. The technique I like to use is I kind of lay my knife flat here, and that way I get a nice even surface areas I cut. I don't want to go into the red meat, all right? Red good, cartilage and stuff bad. So I just kind of keep my knife there, right? And you can see that it's only cutting up here and not anything here. And I'm just kind of leveling this off, all right? And in this section right here, all right, when we grade beef, right, they cut the carcass in between the 12th and 13th rib. This right here is where that 13th rib was laying, right? And the reason that they break it between the 12th and 13th rib is this would be part of the short loin, and in the old days the short loins would be hanging from a different hook, and that hook would hook right around that bone right there. That way the hook wouldn't pull the meat out. It had something to hang on to. So that's why they always selected the 12th and 13th rib, to leave that hook available for the 13th rib. But anyways, you want to make sure we trim all that off, okay? So you can see right here, all right, this is actually bone surface, and that would not be a very good eating experience. So we want to make sure we get all that off. Again, we're just taking the very very surface of stuff off, not cutting deep into that meat. Sometimes I'll refer to that as trimming with a spoon if somebody has a heavy hand and they're going too far in. And this is where the curvature of the knife that you get comes in handy, is when we're doing these kind of cuts. A straight edge doesn't work quite as well for the techniques I'm using right here. Okay, so that's pretty much good on this side. You can see only thing left is fat. Fat is flavor, and that will cook out. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do, we're going to flip it over, right? And again, even though they removed some of this fat, it's not quite the bevel that I want to achieve. Some people will trim this after they've cut the steak, but I prefer to do it ahead of time so that it speeds my work up. You know, when you're doing this for a job as a profession, time is money, and they don't like you to waste it. So I would always come in here and trim this because I know what I wanted. You know, every meat cutter has the vision of the perfect steak they want, and I know by doing this, I get closer to my vision. So the next thing is this segment right here, okay? This is called the back strap. And if you see a steak, New York strip steak in the Cisco system, and it says BSO, then that means back strap off. So we're going to remove this back strap, and I like to call this the complaint department on a New York strip, because this is where somebody will chew on this and they'll get a piece of gristle that ends up back on the plate because you can't chew it up. So you want to be careful when you trim this, okay, because there's two muscles here. The longissimus dorsi is the main muscle, but then you have the multifundus dorsi right here, which is this little highly marbled piece of meat. Some people will call it tiger meat because of all the striations of the fat. You don't want to pull this way because that will loosen that multifundus dorsi and pull it away, and you'll end up losing yield, and you'll end up losing what I think is actually the best piece off the strip. So you want to make sure you get on either side of this when you cut it, okay, and I'm pulling in this direction. I'm not pulling in this direction. All right, so I'm grabbing it and I'm pulling it, much like the technique you use when you're removing silver skin off of a tenderloin. Okay, and you can see I took hardly any red meat there. And that's the goal, right? Sell red, and that's where you make the money. So now I can see clearly where this strap is at. And again, I'm pulling it this way, never pulling it that way because it'll separate along the seam right here, which you do not want. But once you get this removed, that becomes a very delectable piece of meat. Sometimes you can use your point of your knife to go underneath it. Okay, and that's that. So that is now a back strap off New York strip. Okay. Now I'm going to come in here and I'm going to feel, doing this for a number of years, I can feel where there's still a little heavy fat. So I'm going to come in and just trim a little bit off and get it where I want it without going into the red meat. Okay, so this is what's called the saddle right here, and the meat takes a dip right here, and there's always a thicker piece of fat right here. But they did a nice job trimming this one. Okay. Now we're ready to start cutting steaks. Okay, so now as we get ready to cut these steaks, sometimes you get not such a great break right here. A break is where they took the saw and they separated the ribeye from the New York strip. Sometimes the break is very jagged or whatever, and you're going to want to come in and do what I call a face cut, which is to kind of even this up. But with this particular strip, it's a wonderful break. We don't have to trim anything. You're not going to get a funky looking wedge steak, but you still want to watch to maximize your yield. Okay, you can see that these don't align in perfect parallel setup, right? This one's a little angled off this way, this side straight. So what you do is as you cut these steaks here, you slowly cut across to where they're finally straightened out, and then you go straight the whole way through, and that way you maximize your yield. I always cut fat up, left to right. You don't have to. Some people like to cut fat down. Some people go right to left. There's no right or wrong way. It's just as long as you end up with the same yield, then that's great. When I used to train people, I'd be like, you can do it your way until you don't match my yield. And when you don't match my yield, then your way's out and my way's in. So anyway, so I'm going to be cutting, it's going to be about 12-ounce steak right here. Okay, so the reason I like to do the fat first is, look, my knife goes through and I pull, and it's not a sawing motion, right? That's how you can tell somebody's knife is not in the best shape, or if they don't really know what they're doing. But you can see all this pre-trimming I did. What we're ending up with is actual really ready to go steaks right onto the grill. So let's just continue through this muscle, and I've begun the part where I am beveling this out. So it's actually a little bit wider here than it is here, but you can't really see it because it's not detectable to the naked eye unless you get a ruler out. Maybe you can tell from this one. I don't know if you can see it's wider here than it is here, and that is helping me straighten this piece out. So we're parallel, and now I can just start cutting steaks. If I was working in the meat shop, I would be putting every one of these steaks on the scale to make sure I'm on that 12-ounce mark. But when you've done it for a number of years, you get pretty good at it. I've always talked to our customers about, I can come in and show you how to do this, right? I can show you how to cut meat, but I can't teach you how to portion control. That only comes with repetition over and over and over, doing it hundreds and thousands of times to where you hit what you want. I'm getting to what's called the vein end, which is right here. I know I was right on it with that steak. Okay, so when you're talking about a center cut New York strip, you can see that vein, which is right here, started to show up on this steak. It's not on this side. It is on this side. So on a meat buyer's guide for a center cut New York strip, you're allowed vein on one side. And this is the steak we used to call the money maker, right? Because this sells for $10 a pound, this sells for $6 a pound. So we want to make as much as possible onto this vein. And I'll go into that a little bit further as we get into the displaying the cut steaks. And when you get down to this last piece, right, I could get an 8-ounce steak out of this, but I want to point out, you want to watch on the vein side. This is where what's called the pin bone is. This is the top sirloin bone, and that is actually another piece of that cartilage stuff that I was telling you about. And so we want to make sure we watch for that. So as you go to sell this as a steak, I'm going to trim that off, and that's inedible. All right, now let's lay these out so we can get a look at them. So now let's talk about the ways that New York strips can be purchased, okay? So you can buy the whole piece that I sent you, all assembled, 0x1, single pack, 2-pack, 3-pack. We have a couple different options. You can buy just center cut New York strips, okay, which would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I got 11 12-ounce center cut strips off of that one piece. So these would be center cuts, okay? Center cuts are the premium that you want to go with. And again, there's more modifications you can do for trimming this. Shorter tail, removing the knob, even doing this. Some people will cut them double thick and then cut it in half, you'll end up with what's called a Manhattan New York strip. All right, and just different ways of marketing it. This is my favorite way by far. Then you get into vein steaks, right? So vein steaks is not talking about a blood vessel. It's talking about this nerve membrane right here, which becomes more predominant as you get towards the sirloin end, right? And so this is actually a part of gristle, whereas if you buy these in a retail setting, they don't separate these out. What they'll do is they'll put 2 of these, right, with 1 of these in the package, and you'll see something like that, or they'll flip that so you can't see it, and they'll put it in a package like that to kind of hide that one. But you know, when you're talking just round numbers, these are $10, these are $6.50, depending on where the market's at. So there's another way you can buy it too. So you can buy just center cuts, or you can buy just vein ends, $10, $6.50, or you can buy what's called an end-to-end, which encompasses all of the steaks. And as a meat cutting operation, customers that want to buy end-to-end were my best friends, because to me, if you're buying an end-to-end, that means you're willing to accept these vein steaks, right? So as a profiteer, if you're willing to accept 3 of them out of this many, why wouldn't you be willing to accept 4? And so I'll take these 3, and I'll give you 3 more vein steaks, right? And now I can sell these for 10 instead of selling it all for 7. I bumped these up to $8, so I made more, and so I just maximized my profit. So a lot of customers think I'm going to save money buying end-to-end, and you're actually the meat company's best friend when you want to do that, because we're going to manipulate that to our advantage, and you're going to get a disproportionate number of center cuts to veins. It just is a way of making more money. And again, when you're dealing with operators that are buying New Yorks and cutting their own, a lot of them, I say, well, what are you doing with your vein steaks? And they say, well, I use those for my well-dones, or I grind them. You know, well-dones kind of make sense to me, because those people aren't really going to enjoy the difference between a center cut and this if it's well done. But how many well-dones do you sell, right? You end up with extra of these. Also, if you're grinding it, all right, so if you paid $7.50 a pound for this, and you're grinding it, and you say you're saving money that way, well, are you really? Because you just paid $7.50 for ground beef, and we can sell you some of our best ground beef in the marketplace for about $4. So I would always say buy the centers, buy the ground beef, and you'll end up in the long run. So you can see this is how much yield loss we had after proper trimming and cutting of these into steaks. So you're talking about a yield, including all this, probably somewhere around 83%, I would guess.